Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about minorities trying to get equal rights or be treated fairly with respect. So, as you might remember, back in the 1800s, what happened was minorities, we're mostly talking about African Americans and women, were trying to be treated fairly or the same or equal as everyone else. And as we go into the 20th century or the 1900s, that continues. And when we're talking specifically right now about African Americans, two of the most important African American leaders during this time, the early 1900s, are going to be two men, one named Booker T. Washington and the other named W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, both these men had the same idea in mind. They both wanted to get equality or be treated fairly and equally as African Americans and for all African Americans. But they had very different ideas and ways that they thought this could happen. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to talk about these two men and the ideas they had of how to help African Americans get equality. And we're also going to look at their shared goal, or really what they were trying to achieve. So we're going to do that by watching a couple of short YouTube videos. So give me just a second and we'll get those loaded.
What's a black man got to do to get ahead in this country? Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois were two of the most important leaders of the black community during the late 19th and early 20th century, but don't think these leaders worked hand in hand. Like Adams and Jefferson, MLK and Malcolm X, Professor X and Magneto, their ideas were often opposing, if not adversarial to each other. Take Booker T. Washington, born into slavery, freed by the 13th Amendment, initially self-taught. He would go on to co-found the Tuskegee Institute that would train African Americans in agriculture and industry and help promote their economic progress. This soon put Washington on the national stage, and many would come, both black and white, to hear him speak, and even resulted in him becoming the first African American invited to the White House. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, was born after the Civil War in Massachusetts, educated in integrated schools, and would first experience true Jim Crow when he attended the historically black Fisk University in Tennessee. Now, this isn't to say that the North was a bastion of tolerance, as seen at Harvard, where Du Bois would eventually get his doctorate, the first African American to do so, despite the fact that Harvard refused to accept his Fisk degree or let him stay on campus after 6 p.m. Du Bois went on to publish many works on the current and future state of African Americans and even co-founded the NAACP. So why do Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois matter? Washington and Du Bois both had their own plans for how blacks should achieve success in America. Washington proposed that African Americans' primary concern should be achieving independence through learning trades. Addressed in what's known as his Atlanta Compromise speech, he urged blacks to postpone battles for equal political rights and instead focus on economic security. He advocated for the temporary allowance of segregation and admittedly lower political status for blacks that would ideally lead to peaceful acceptance in American society. While this position might be seen as pragmatic, especially in the post-Reconstruction Jim Crow South, to many it reeked of accommodation. W.E.B. Du Bois was certainly in that camp. He felt that the submission to any denial of rights was unacceptable. He felt that civil rights and higher education were uncompromisingly critical to the success of African Americans, and spoke of the talented 10th, a small segment of the black population that would lead the way to true political, social, and economic equality. Addressing the advancement of African Americans and Washington's philosophies, Du Bois would say this: that the way for a people to gain respect is not by continually belittling and ridiculing themselves, and that the way for a people to gain their reasonable rights is not by voluntarily throwing them away and insisting that they do not want them. And that is why Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois matter.
It's time for having fun with learning and a W.E.B. Du Bois biography for kids. Okay. So in history, looking up and sharing stories about heroes is what I love. So if you've never heard of W.E.B. Du Bois, don't trip, because I got you. For starters, W.E.B. Du Bois was a journalist, educator, and well-known civil rights activist. W.E.B. Du Bois was born on February 23, 1868, in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and that's where life began for him. During this time in history, many African Americans were not fortunate enough to go to school and get a good education. This wasn't the same for W.E.B. Du Bois. Growing up in a mainly European town, he didn't see racism like others encountered. There, he had the opportunity to go to school with other white children and get an education. It wasn't until later on in life, when he attended Fisk University, that he encountered racism for the first time. After seeing how African Americans were treated, that sparked a fire in W.E.B. Du Bois, and he began to stand up for the rights of African Americans. Continuing on in school, W.E.B. Du Bois got his bachelor's degree there at Fisk University, but he wasn't stopping there. Another big thing that he did was in 1895, W.E.B. Du Bois became the first African American to get his doctorate from Harvard University. Oh yeah. Now, of course, none of this is as easy as it seems, but Dr. W.E. Du Bois did his thing. Just like it costs money today, he went to school, worked hard, took some odd jobs, got scholarships, and also took up loans to get through school. After finishing school here in the U.S., W.E.B. Du Bois went to school overseas in Berlin. That's Germany. It was there he got to meet people who had different ways of thinking on how to treat others in society, and W.E.B. Du Bois brought those ideas right back here to the United States of America. W.E.B. Du Bois went on to publish writings like The Philadelphia Negro, A Social Study, and The Souls of Black Folk. Now, one thing that put him on a national stage was his disagreement with Booker T. Washington, another African-American leader there at that time, who had the Atlanta Compromise. With the Atlanta Compromise, it sacrificed African-Americans being in leadership in order to get good jobs. But W.E.B. Du Bois wasn't hearing that. He stood for full equality for everybody, no matter their race, color, or creed. Now, another big accomplishment in his life was, of course, fighting for the rights of African Americans. He helped to co-found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is now known today mainly as the NAACP. But check this out. Living his life and fighting for the rights of African Americans is what he did. He ended up dying at the age of 95 on August 27th in 1963. The crazy thing about this was he died one day before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech in Washington on August 28, 1963. When it came to the life of W.E.B. Du Bois, his voice will go down as one of the major contributors to the African American and civil rights movement in the early 20th century. And I hope you enjoyed those fun facts with W.E.B. Du Bois for kids.
So that's a little bit about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So this brings us to the next thing. And this is a Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court, if you'll remember, is the highest court in the land. So they decide what's constitutional and what isn't constitutional. And we had during this time period one of the most important Supreme Court cases, and it's called Plessy versus Ferguson. And so we're going to watch a short YouTube video for you so that you can understand this court case and what it meant for minorities.
Story time with Mr. Beat.
What's diagonal? My name is Mr. Beat, and this is the story of a very famous Supreme Court case called Plessy v. Ferguson.
Once upon a time, there was a man named Homer Plessy. He was born during the Civil War in New Orleans and enjoyed many freedoms growing up. However, those freedoms disappeared after Reconstruction ended in 1877. Jim Crow laws legalized racial segregation throughout the South. In Louisiana, the Separate Car Act forced blacks and whites to sit in separate railway cars. Plessy was 7/8 white, but he was 1/8 black. And under Louisiana law, he was classified as black. Therefore, he would have to ride the black train car, even though normally, with his pale skin color, he could have ridden in the white train car without anyone even noticing. On June 7, 1892, Plessy did just that. He bought a first-class ticket and boarded a whites-only train car. After Plessy had taken a seat, he was asked to vacate it and sit instead in the blacks-only car. Plessy refused and was arrested immediately by a detective who had come there for the sole purpose of arresting him. In fact, the detective knew ahead of time that Plessy was 1/8 black and was planning to board as a protest to the Separate Car Act. Plessy went to jail, pled his case to Judge John Howard Ferguson, and said that the Separate Car Act denied him his rights under the 13th and 14th Amendments. Ferguson ruled that Louisiana had the right to regulate railroad companies as long as they ran within state boundaries. Plessy was found guilty and fined $25, which was a lot back then. However, he appealed his case all the way to the Supreme Court. In a 7-1 decision, the Supreme Court rejected Plessy's arguments based on the 14th Amendment and said that state laws requiring racial segregation in public facilities was okay, as long as the quality of each group's public facilities was to remain equal. This became known as the now infamous separate but equal doctrine. Plessy v. Ferguson made segregation practices in the South seem even more legitimate, and because of that, Jim Crow laws became even more common. The case stood all the way until 1954, when it was overruled by the court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education. The end.
So there is a little information for you on African American rights. And Plessy versus Ferguson is extremely important because it basically makes segregation or separating people based on their race legal throughout the United States until the 1950s. So when we get to talking about Dr. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, now you have a little bit of background of what has been going on with African American rights. So what about women as a minority? Well, women also had been trying to get equality since the 1800s. And as we go into the 1900s, women are going to really try and get equal rights, especially the right to vote. And so women are going to have huge protests. They're going to march. They're going to write to their congressmen. And in fact, an interesting thing is that women in the western United States, in states like Montana and Idaho, Wyoming, they had the right to vote years and years before women in the United States can. So what's going to happen is that women are going to be voting in the West before it's even legal in the United States. In fact, you're going to have women representatives in their state senates and their Congress before that's even legal in the U.S. But in 1920, the U.S. government is going to pass the 19th Amendment, and this will give all women the right to vote. So let's watch a short little video on the 19th Amendment.
Now you have heard of women's rights and how we've tried to reach new heights. If we're all created equal, that's us too. But you will probably not recall that it's not been too long at all since we even had the right to cast a vote. Well, sure, some men bow down and call us misses. Let us hang the wash out and wash the dishes. But when the time rolled around to elect a president, what did they say, sister? What did they say? They said, see you later, alligator. And don't forget my mashed potatoes, cause I'm going downtown to cast my vote for president. Oh, we were suffering until suffering. Not a woman who could vote no matter what age. And the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. And now we pull down on the lever, cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Those pilgrim women who braved the foe could cook the turkey, but they could not vote. Even Betsy Ross, who sewed the flag, was left behind that first election day. What a shame, sisters! Then Susan B. Anthony, and Julia Howe, Lucretia Mott, and others. They showed us how they carried signs and marched in lines until at long last the law was passed. Oh, we were suffering until suffering. Not a woman who could vote no matter what age. Then the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. And now we cool down on the lever, cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Yes, the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Yes, the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. All right, we got it now. Since 1920, sisters unite.
So, like the Schoolhouse Rock video showed, there were some really important women who were involved in this. And one of the most important is a woman named Susan B. Anthony. And Susan B. Anthony was one of the most important women in the women's rights movement, and for women to get the right to vote, also called suffrage. So suffrage means getting the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony would try and dress up like a man to go and vote. She got arrested and thrown in jail, but after all of her efforts, women did help get the right to vote, along with Stanton and Mott and Howe and a lot of other women who really worked to do this. Now, another interesting fact is Susan B. Anthony was actually one of the very first women to get on currency. So you might have heard of what's called a Susan B. Anthony coin, and those are still around. So now you're going to tell me a little bit about women and African Americans during this time and answer a couple of questions. To finish up Unit 1, we're going to talk about two of the most important presidents during this time, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Theodore Roosevelt was known for saying, "Carry a big stick and speak softly," which basically meant if you can make people afraid of you, then you don't have to yell at them to get them to do what you want. Roosevelt was part of what was called the Rough Riders, and he's going to be someone we study later on when we talk about the Spanish-American War. But for the progressives, what Roosevelt did was he helped push through laws to make the country safer. So we put into effect like the Pure Food and Drug Act, which made our food safe. He also worked on helping working conditions and safety for our workers. Now, as far as Woodrow Wilson is going to be president during World War I. And we'll talk a little bit more about him as we get into World War I. But these are some of the important presidents of the early 1900s. So I have a couple of little music video parodies for you to watch, which kind of go over the progressive time period and help kind of put everything together.
There was a rage coming off of the Gilded Age. The people wanted change, someone to regulate, to fix society, one plagued by pain and greed, and to make government fair. The progressive era is love, but because exposing corruption those conditions of life you won't believe. Sinclair's the jungle's discussing, now the doorbell's got us discussing shady tactics of Rockefeller. Welcome to the progressive era, it's a progressive era, Three presidents, starting with Roosevelt, square dealing for the 3 C's, busting up corporate greed. But Taft wants to bust them all, good or bad they all must fall. Bull Moose decides to run, Wilson wins the election. Meanwhile, 16th Amendment taxing it comes, 17th makes the recollection of the senators at last. Prohibition is 18, how did it pass? Women are finally granted suffrage, voting rights no longer a bridge. 19th Amendment is another triumph of the progressive era, it's a progressive era, Civil rights, they don't advance for African Americans in these decades. Washington and her boys can't agree. Ida B. Wells implores for the anti-lynching code. Unions, if you're white male and skilled AFL, the Wobblies work for everyone else. Limiting child labor, better working conditions for him and her. You think that we'd learn a lesson in the 20s? There's regression. Still the U.S. made the better by the gains of the progressive era.
That was the progressive era, and let me know in the comments